So if you're unfamiliar with South Africa, I mean, because you threw around like, so for example, the name of something like Afriforum, who some people might think or refer to as a civil society organization. And it seems that you are classing them as part of this. And just to sort of throw that out there, I mean, they're famous, for example, for going on speaking tours of the US, meeting with some of the very people we mentioned earlier, like Steve King. I'm not sure if they've met with Bannon, or even, I think they may have gotten a selfie with Trump. But like that organization in South Africa, they have a reputation as like a civil society organization, but you kind of making them part of the right. Can you just quickly just give us sort of like the scaffolding of the right? Yeah, because that might be helpful too.
Yeah, I would say that in South Africa, so there's a few different things going on. The one thing is a very sort of the hard kind of extremist rights, where you see sort of survivalist groups like Die Sakelanders, for example, who themselves have this kind of camp of saints sort of apocalyptic thing. And they literally, they have training camps where they're training to use weapons. And they've had, for example, politicians from the AFD, the far-right party in Germany, have come out here to do training with them. Then Afriforum is kind of in this, as you said, they present themselves as a civil rights or what they call minority rights organization. And they're very, very careful about the language they use. So, for example, they don't use the phrase white genocide. They use the phrase farm murders. And I think they do this thing where they use sort of dog whistles that will appeal to sort of white supremacists. And they also very much inflame these sentiments. But at the same time, they always sort of use a lot of obfuscation in order to present themselves as this kind of civil rights organization. But I think the politics and the strategy that they use, it's both rooted in sort of Afrikaner nationalism in South Africa, but also I think that they're very influenced by both this kind of right-wing shift in the Republican Party and also in Europe with sort of far-right parties which have rebranded themselves as representing white cultural identity. And then the other sort of tier, sort of the final one, not the final one, but one of the other big ones is the more sort of mainstream conservatism, where it's not necessarily organized around white identity explicitly, but it's organized around things like free speech. And these are all euphemisms as well, because I do very much care about civil liberties, just to clarify this, but I think a lot of the people who are using it genuinely don't. And that's the kind from the perspective of the United States, for example, would see there's all these kind of podcasts and sort of Twitter influencers, which use this sort of, they describe themselves as free thinkers or individualists, but it's pretty much the straight up kind of it's everything from sort of Ben Shapiro type of right-wing culture war stuff to QAnon, all these kind of things. So I think those are the sort of three main tiers. But I think with Afriforum especially, I think that there's been a kind of almost a weird naivety about them in this country, because I think that their politics are very explicit if you actually read their sort of material. And then as you mentioned, Sean, I just wanted to just quickly mention, Afriforum has made a very, very sustained effort to make inroads with the Republican Party and also with far-right parties in Western Europe. So for example, Ernst Ruetz from Afriforum, he has appeared on Tucker Carlson's show. Trump tweeted about the sort of farm murder kind of conspiracy, and they've taken credit for that. There's actually a picture of Ernst Ruetz with John Bolton before John Bolton and Trump fell out. So that's you can Google that online. And actually, Afriforum was actually at CPAC this year, which is the big sort of conservative rap club Coachella, I guess you might call it. They were definitely there. I don't think that they got to speak though, but they definitely were there. So they're making regular trips to the United States.
So just one other quick one, because I know Will is like, what is it, like at the bit? Is like he wants to ask his question. But I have another one in terms of the scaffolding. So you mentioned this kind of like cultural podcast. So there's two, if you could just there's two other ones that I quickly want to say a little bit more for me if you want about this kind of informal grouping. So one of them is like popular figures, musicians. I mean, I just, for people who don't know, these are like, there's a South African musician called like Steve Hoffman. I don't know what his constituency looks like, but he amplifies a lot of this politics. And then there was that moment where there was that popular song by Bob van Blerk. He was an Afrikaans singer, and he made the song about General de Wet. I forgot what the song was called now. And then I think you're sort of making, I think you're alluding to these, like, the set of these mostly English-speaking podcasts. So these are not, so this is, when people say right-wing in South Africa, they think it's only like, and I think Will's going to get there with the next question, but people think we're only speaking about white Afrikaners. There's also like there's an English segment to this, and I think you're sort of alluding to this when you mention this kind of way that they talk about culture, the way that they bring in a sort of globalized right-wing discourse, particularly from the US, Ben Shapiro, you know, that kind of politics. Can you just quickly unpack that quickly?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for bringing that up, because I think one of the problems in South Africa, there's this kind of stereotype that the far righters, you know, the Avia beer, it's these kind of guys dressed in khaki, you have weapons. But I think, as you mentioned, Sean, so there's a very much an online presence of that. And so Steve Hofmeyer is an Afrikaans singer who is, you know, constantly saying racially inflammatory things. But if you look online, he's also interacting with these sort of podcasts, and they all have names like Germ Warfare or the Renegade Report. There's a new one that's called White Noise, and they, the thing is, they do sort of signal boost a lot of the kind of Afrikaner nationalist rhetoric, but they themselves are, you know, much more concerned with things like they've got this kind of hyper individualism. So, for example, there was this really intense sort of anti-mask sentiment on these kind of channels, especially in the first few months of South Africa's national quarantine. But what you see is, and that's like, it's a whole mix of things as well, because, you know, it goes from sort of these very extreme kind of free market libertarians to gun nuts, basically. And so the thing is, they would often, they also do this thing where they accuse their critics, like sort of leftist critics, of being fascist. But it's a case of, a very sort of individualistic, kind of hyper-capitalist sort of, Anglo kind of racism, and with the sort of the more sort of well-known kind of Afrikaner nationalist sentiment. So they're all in the kind of same ecosystem, if that makes sense.